Thank you very much for the opening presentation. In fact, the points that you raised as the elements of the strategic approach and listing some of those topics, then reiterating them in those final questions were also very high on my notes as the moderator's perspective. So let's have that in mind. Panel, what more can the EU do? Can EU do more on this multilateral sea setting aspect? And how can we foster the political recognition of the strategic value of space, maybe even beyond the space sector? I think that is really I would even call it as the homework of the audience that is in this room, which is mostly the space family, which is mostly the community that knows each other, but the community that also need to branch out and vector out of this maybe shared recognition, which is in this room, but maybe not necessarily elsewhere. I would add a specific point, maybe another one that I would like to bring to the conversation as something that the panel could look into, which is the aspect of how do we organize ourselves and how do we scale up in what we do. I think it resonates with your question on what you can do more. So let's look into these topics. The structure of the panel will be the usual as in the previous session. So we'll start with an opening remarks by all the panelists, and then we'll have some time for discussion. I have the pleasure to welcome three panelists today. Dinka Dinkova from DG Defis, Major General Stefano Conte from the European Defence Agency, and Joost Elstak from ICEYE, the representative of the private sector here. Let's start with this order. Ms. Dinkova, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for the invitation. As you heard, my name is Dinka Dinkova. I work for the European Commission, the Director General for Defense Industry and Space, where I'm Deputy Head of Unit dealing with innovation, new space, space defense synergies. As you can see, all of it is in the name. I would like to pick up on some of the points that were raised in the introductory, very insightful speech. First of all, this space strategy, the EU space strategy for security and defense, has been a real change of mindset, I would say. At the EU level, we have recognized and loudly accepted space as a strategic domain, which I think it has a lot of implications, also the way we do the space and what we would like to do with our space ambitions in the future. In an increasingly complex, volatile geopolitical environment in which we live today, we all see space becoming more congested and more contested, but the strategy calls for the EU becoming a real space power, strengthening its strategic posture in space as a space power. What does it mean? What does it bring? I think that first thing, we need to better defend our space systems and space assets. Many critical functions of our society, important sectors of our economy, depend on space systems, the services, and the data that derive from that. So we have a responsibility to ensure the protection of those space systems. They're becoming more and more digital, exposed to different kinds of evolving threats, more cybersecurity threats. So we have to make our space capabilities more resilient and resistant to cyber attacks. How do we do that? We have different tools within the Commission's prerogative, the regulations, legislation. This will be one of the key pillars of the upcoming space law. You have heard about it yesterday. We want to enhance the overall level of resilience of our space assets and space capabilities. But also there are other ways to implement a culture that is more aware about security, to prepare our industry to be more security savvy and more prepared to deal with cyber attacks. And this is why we have launched earlier this year something called EU Space ISAC, Information Sharing Analysis Center, which is a network of industry by industry to create a trusted environment where companies can talk among themselves about security threats, to share best practices, information, and knowledge, how to deal with increasing cybersecurity threats. Number two, we need to enhance the use of space as a key enabler for security and defense. Our space systems, EU space systems, already provide services to the defense community. Suffice to mention Galileo, public regulated service, Iris Square is a constellation which was designed with the dual use by design. We are also reflecting on an Earth observation governmental service to increase the situational awareness of the EU and member states for the future. So a lot of things on our radar. More and more synergies between space and defense. But first of all, we need also to build sovereign European technologies and European capabilities. Yes, we need to engage with external partners. This is essential if we want to promote responsible, peaceful use of space. But for that, we also need to build our strategic autonomy. We need to get away from strategic dependencies. To do this, we first need to wear out our vulnerabilities. And within the Commission, we have developed a toolbox. One of the tools is this Observatory of Critical Technologies, which is looking at the gaps, at the vulnerabilities, looking at products of strategic importance to develop technology roadmaps that will then drive investments at EU and national level. Finally, we need an industry that is innovative, that is competitive, and that is capable. And this is one of our main objectives, to stimulate the competitiveness of our industry. This means incumbent legacy industry, but it means also new commercial space actors. And we see that they have an increasing role to play, including in space security architectures. What we have done and are doing in the Commission through initiatives such as Cassini, our space entrepreneurship initiative, is to stimulate support SMEs and startups and stimulate investments in the most promising European startups. We try to bridge the gaps, the bridges with defense, and through the European Union Defense Innovation Scheme, we try to create synergies between space and defense startups so that they can collaborate more. And finally, we will need skilled people, enough trained people in Europe to take this challenge forward. So I would say that with the space strategy for security and defense, we have an ambitious roadmap ahead. For the first time, we have openly broken the silos between space and defense. Many of the actions are already being implemented. There's a lot of ambition ahead, and we need to avail ourselves of the means, the tools, to make this ambition a reality in the years ahead. And for this, we need to work collectively, as was said, institutions, with industry, with the member states, with new and established industries. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, the takeaways that I take out of your introduction were to the defense, the protection, to better defend the space. It's preparing and supporting the industry more and even better, and enhancing the use of space in security and defense applications. Major General Kohn, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Well, let me start to say that when I was younger now, they were teaching me that space is the final frontier. Let's be honest, I don't know if space is really the final frontier, but what I know for sure is the next frontier. And when I say next frontier, looking at a defense perspective, I mean two important pillars in that. The first one is space economy, and the second one is defense in space. Let's first concentrate in this introduction on defense and space, and eventually I will come back on space economy later on. Defense and space is our core business, but we were asked to talk about how to operationalize, and we start to work after the space strategy at European level to operationalize with the last CDP, the Capability Development Priorities done at European level. And two of the 22 priorities are related to space, in particular space services, that is the most traditional one that everybody knows, and defense and space operations. Now, for each one of these two elements, we are addressing that through three lines of activities in terms of implementing a strategy. The first one, we need an operational strategy on how to address the EU space strategy. And what I mean is from a very pragmatic point of view, we need to define end, ways, and means. And that is very helpful for supporting member states in setting priorities, in fostering their effort, and drive down the resources into a coordinated area. And we have a special forum for that. It's called the Defense in Space Forum. This forum participates 21 member states, and all of them are very much already into the activities on defining, especially this element, to make clarity on what are our priorities. That will derive, obviously, R&D. They will derive collaboration. They will derive eventually program in the sector. Second, we need to have, and this again, the Defense in Space Forum will provide that, a unified approach to these end ways and means that we will deliver. I would say even starting from clear understanding what we really mean at European level for defense in space. Some other countries have a much more advanced and elaborated concept on what they mean to operate in space in the term of defense. We are still not fully there, but we are going there. And we require to have obviously an harmonized view from all the 27 member states. We need to have a unified approach to avoid fragmentation of efforts, to avoid different activities taken in a solitary way, sometimes duplicating, and especially to synergize all the possibilities that are in all the different countries toward a common objective and a common goal. Finally, and that is related to space economy, we need to have a defense requirement and needs that are fully encapsulated in whatsoever plans, policies, and projects that are developed for space at European level. And that's why we have a very strong collaboration with the GDFIS in terms of space to progressively enhance this cooperation and bring our military requirements and needs into the system. Space economy and space activities have a much wider impact on general population than everybody can think. In my previous job in the United States, there were a lot of studies to evaluate the impact of space on day-to-day life. And I can tell you that some of those studies were surprising even for a person like me that know very well the subject, you know, in terms of the impact they have for the normal life. That's why I believe that civilian and military cooperation should go hand in hand. And not only for obviously the economy of scale we can reach, but even for ensuring a better protected capabilities for our civil, governmental, and economic institution. Because obviously they have an impact on our citizen and in our society. And final, there is an element of cross-feeding of knowledge and experience. And that is another element that we will implement in the next future because we have a lot of understanding in some dynamics that are related to the space that sometimes in the past they were not fully considered because space, honestly, was mostly a frontier for scientists, for researchers, for peaceful operation. Unfortunately, that's not anymore the case, and we have to address that. Thank you.
I think there is this particular message, one of the messages that you put forward that caught my attention, which was the notion of the unified approach. It's a phrase which is self-explanatory, but maybe not when you look into the details. And I think this particular aspect of the two keywords that you used, avoiding fragmentation and duplication is extremely important in the European case, because the way how we are organized with the European level of action on one side, but still defense becoming in the remit or the perimeter of competence of member states, this is, my understanding, this is crucial. How we move forward, I wouldn't say how we can reconcile, but maybe using your keyword, what is the pathway to better have synergies between what the countries will continue to doing nationally and then how the European level action can improve in that regard. And what's also interesting for me is that While I wanted as a moderator to maybe orientate the conversation or, driving the capabilities, like the three of you as the three speakers so far, all use the word or all address the notion of protection of assets. So I'm discovering a bit of a trend here in the conversation that maybe we need to pay a bit more attention to. Anyway, moving forward, Joost, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for having us as well. So hello, everybody. My name is Joost Elstak, and I'm ICEYE's Vice President for Missions in Europe. As the only private entity on the table here, I'm sure, on the floor, I'm sure you'll permit me to take a slightly different angle here to give a slightly different perspective. Maybe for a bit of audience participation, who here knows what ICEYE does? If you could please raise your hand. Okay, good. Some knowledge, some work to be done as well. So allow me to, in a minute or two, explain what we do and also try to sort of justify why I'm here and what perspective we think we can bring. I think in summary, it's that I would like to provide like an outsider in view on what we see happening in the world and how that could benefit Europe as well. So ICEYE is one of Europe's fastest growing, if not the fastest growing new space companies. We're about 700 people at the moment, fully European, based in Finland. We are operating the world's biggest fleet of radar satellites. We currently have 34 assets in orbit and will be 40 plus by the end of the year. So that's quite significant. The vision that we have is, in the end, that the systems that we build will provide a global level, a global source of truth or reference, if you will. So what we keep saying to each other is every square meter, every hour. That's what we're trying to work towards with the team that we have. Now, as I said, we're fully European. We started with the business case of monitoring icebergs. Of course, that's where the name comes from. And now we find ourselves about 10 years in as a defense company, or at least partially involved in defense as well. So I think this is one of the perspectives that we definitely can touch upon as well. Because the capabilities that we have are now more and more developed and capable. With the assets that we have, we come over every spot over the Earth once every 1 or 2 hours, which of course has a good defense application as well, because radar always works. You can see through clouds, you can see through the night. So I can guarantee you can get information every hour or two. And that's really been a shift for a lot of our customers. And half my work is preaching, I tell people, just to make people aware of what current capabilities are in this field. Now at ICEYE, we are working very closely with the Ukrainian government. That's public knowledge, I think, that everybody's aware of. And that's also allowed us to develop the things that we make and to get a different perspective on how you can use this type of technology in the defense field as well. So I'm not I would say I'm not a policy expert in that sense, but we do talk, of course, to our users and our customers in this defense field regularly and quite a lot. And we bring that experience here to the table as well. And there were some questions raised in the beginning already. And I think I can touch upon from the industry perspective already. We're seeing lots of things, of course. But my first comment is please make use of us. As in the European industry is very capable. Make use of us in the sense of make use of the full breadth and capability of all types and sizes of European industry. I think that's one of the first observations to share. We have the privilege of also doing a lot of business outside of Europe, in the US, South America, and also in Asia. And I think that's one of the areas where I think in Europe we could particularly improve, and we can touch upon the details on that later on. And the other thing that was mentioned as well, so what can we do better? I think as Europe, from the industry perspective, we are really looking for reliable, long-term customers that we can depend on for the business that we have. And that's one of the things that's already, and I have to say it's been improved a lot. We've benefited from a lot of the things that have been going on. But I think there's definitely still room for improvement there. And as a last point also, so we have some time for the discussion. There was a comment on how can we get more recognition of the added value that space has for defense. And is stop talking about space. In the end, it's about how you use it on the ground. I think it's very critical that we understand. We talk to a lot of the national actors. Space in the defense sense, when it at least comes through to intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance, it fits into a bigger system. It's an element, it's a layer. And if you only talk about space, then you're never going to get to the end user in the end, because he uses it in a much wider context. It's an element in a bigger system. So we need to be talking about the system. and maybe a bit less about space if you want to get close to the user. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
No, I think that agnosticism towards the technology when it serves a given policy goal is extremely important to highlight, because it goes beyond the defense to all the other users of space infrastructure. Name your field. It's like how space does provide the added value. So what you're saying, it's always part of the broader layer, where it also needs in that understanding provide added value to other potential technology domains that fit with that. Let me maybe kick off the discussion with you, Joost, again, and as well, really putting the spotlight on one of the messages that you discussed, that maybe we can discuss in a little bit more detail how your experience with customers elsewhere, what kind of message does that give to Europe? An example that I have in mind is one of the latest policy developments in the United States, the release of the Space Force Commercial Integration Strategy. Right? It's a significant policy move, specifying how U.S. military is willing to maybe delegate some responsibilities to a much higher level to the private sector. What is your experience? It's still maybe a new company, but that has experienced customers elsewhere in the world. What type of practices do you think can work well in your case, and maybe can Europe integrate those even more?
Okay, interesting. A few thoughts on that, sort of trying to zoom out a little bit. So if you look at, for instance, Asia, let's start with the continental comparison. So we have quite some business in Asia, and there we see that it's very much nation-driven, right? There's no United States of Asia in that sense. So there's very clear national priorities, and they're very focused on what's going to happen in the Taiwan and the North Korean region on defense. So they all have their national strategies with clear timelines and clear objectives that they need to meet. And that makes it fairly easy for us to work with them, because it's a clear set. The US is less fragmented than Asia, of course, but of course huge, and they're quite able to, I think the word is federate, to funnel all of the needs of the different users in the US, and you see that with Space Command now as well, into one big pot of demand. And I think there's some good examples as well with how they use the full breadth of the industry in the US. If you look at Space Command with the announcement they made, they also recently announced that proliferated constellations is something they will pursue in the future as the baseline for many of the systems that they make. If you look at SDA, the other big program, the missile defense, there was a conscious decision there to multi-source it. It didn't only go to Lockheed and Boeing. There were dozens of companies involved, and several direct as well. And that sort of allowed them to use the full breadth of the industry, but also to take a bit more risk. So that's one of the things. Risk appetite, very fashionable word, of course, but that's something that we see in the US is a bit more ingrained in the DNA than we see in some of the other countries as well.
Maybe sticking, Ms. Dinkova, I will ask you to maybe react on that if you have any specific points. Sticking to the topic of the usage or reliance on commercial assets in space for security and defense. I mean, you mentioned in your remarks that in the remit or in the ambition of DEFIS, the Commission, it is about preparing the industry, strengthening the industry. Looking ahead, is there something on the Commission plate or to-do list that will be taken into action along these objectives?
First of all, I'm very happy to share the stage with ICEYE, because it's a great example. You don't need to raise awareness when you have a success story like that. A company which I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the early days were supported by Horizon 2020 SME instrument, and then we see the company today more than 700 employees with commercial activities across the globe. So it's a great example and demonstration of the capacity and the capability of these commercial space actors. What we in the Commission we have in the past 4 or 5 years, we have implemented this deliberate strategy to try to drive our new space ecosystem through Cassini entrepreneurship initiative. We try to support the startups and the SMEs to develop commercial space solutions that can be of use also for security and defense users. And this is happening. This is happening in many of our member states, which rely on commercial space capabilities nowadays, either to complement existing national assets, to develop new assets, to test new capacities. At European level, we are trying to create and incentivize this ecosystem through different means, through matchmaking events where we bring the companies with investors and with corporate partners, through a business acceleration service that we've put in place to help companies, about 40 companies a year, to go through a rigorous coaching program to achieve commercial growth. We are also trying to adapt our procurement practices. And here I pick up on something that was said. It is true that our procurement practices are not yet as friendly and as risk-taking as in other parts of the world, but we are trying. In the EU Space Program, we have tried something called dynamic purchasing system. We have awarded contracts to 9 startups that don't even have the capacities ready. But for them, an anchor tenancy contract from an institutional partner from the Commission is a great incentive also to attract further private investments. So the risk-taking culture is not the same as we see across the Atlantic. We need to work more with our lending institutions, and we're trying to build capacity also in the financial community to understand, first of all, the attractiveness of investing in space and be able to take more risks with integrating these new space actors.
Thank you. I will take one more moderator's privilege for another question, but then we'll open the floor also for the Q&A with the audience. Director Kohn, I will get this one to you. You mentioned, I would specifically maybe like to touch upon the Defense in Space Forum as an initiative and see maybe what, if there are some lessons learned or best practices that you've noticed in that, and also looking ahead, as we did with the 2 previous speakers, looking ahead, what the EDA will do or plan to do to sort of activate on all of those aspects that you mentioned in your introductory remarks.
Yes. Well, let's be very honest. We have been shifting toward a very pragmatic approach of delivery instead of just analyzing, assessing, and getting more in deep in what we can do to harmonize overall the defense at European level. And looking at delivery means be concrete. And what we did, and we presented in May to the Minister of Defense already a list of collaborative opportunities in several different sectors that are functional to achieve, because we did the bilaterals with all the member states. We know exactly what they need, on how to drive. Among them, some of them are space related. And the Defense in Space Forum will take over that to start to dig in a little bit more, because our end game, our end scope is to have a declaration of intent from the interested member state to pursue it in a joint way, specific programs that are defense related. When I say defense related, I don't mean military related or military capability. I'm talking about defense related, because there are activities like, for example, space situation awareness that people consider as a complementary. In reality, is step number 1. If you want to ensure insertion in the space, because when you have to launch, you need to know where you are launching, what you are, where you want to position the satellites. When you want to do something in space, you need to know exactly what is there. And there are thousands and thousands of objects circulating around the Earth. Many of you know much better than me. And that is not something that you can just do it. It's not anymore like it was 50 years ago that was relatively free. And position the satellites in the right place is very much difficult sometimes to find the right spot. So security, and obviously it will monitor even what all the other satellites will do. So space security, space situational awareness is very much high in our interest in terms of operationalizing that with specific programs. And then obviously there is, if we want to really deter and ensure security, we really need to know. Director Benedicta was mentioning something about preventing, assessing possible threats and elements like that. Well, honestly, if we don't have early warning satellites, that is something much more than just observing the Earth and the surface like we did in traditional way. It will be much more open. for the future in terms of possible collaborative opportunities and possible projects that could be even explored at European level, since the magnitude of the project cannot be done by few member states only or with only member state. And these early warning can have even civilian activities. I mean, they are not just dorming there and doing just the in case of. No, they will be supporting and being able to integrate their capability in the overall space observation activities. That is very much valuable. But my last point, I want to say, don't pull strings on space. Space is right now much more like it was air systems at the beginning of the 19th centuries. We moved from a bunch of crazy people trying to fly with very rudimental system, very dangerous. And in relatively few years, we had a growth of the air systems. If you look what happens in only 100 years is astonishing in that sector. And most of the driver, it was not only military, it was mostly civilian. The possibility to have economy into the new dominion. And I think that space economy, to come back to my first point, it will be one of the biggest key driver for space activity in the future. And there will be more and more civilian actors operating from, in, and to the space. And my recommendation, if I can say something so big, is not to put too many strings around a space law, and instead create a law that free up resources and incentive for everybody, big, small companies, to see the opportunity, invest, and move on into the space. That's it.
Well, you're also a military person. How does the military then look at this vibrant space ecosystem if it happens? I guess I would assume that it's coming back to that question which I was putting forward, which is to what extent is, or are we as a society, or are we as a community in security and defense willing to delegate to the commercial sector? If I use your reasoning, we will have a much more vibrant space ecosystem. Will, in your view, the militaries in Europe or in a way, in some form of a European military structure, if it ever happens, will be willing to accept more risk and say maybe some of these tasks, I don't know if it are the early warning satellites, that is something that the industry can do much more with a much deeper ownership and responsibility in it? Or is it something where the public will always need to be more, or the public sector will always need to be more engaged with?
The defense is one element of our society. Is one element that is very relevant, is one element of protecting our citizen, our institution, is the key element to make sure that our institution, our society can progress and develop nicely. And if I can give you an example, is only a fraction of the entire. Like in the automotive systems, military vehicles are only a very small fraction of the entire automotive sector. That doesn't mean that they are competing one against the other. Actually not. There is a lot of cross-feeding between one and the other in terms of technology, materials, and solutions. So I see space in the same way. There will be a growing permanence of civilian activities, thinking about only the production of high quality material that cannot be produced on the earth. And it will be more and more required here, because they have specific capabilities. Obviously, when we are moving our society or our economics into the space, automatically it becomes vulnerable. It will become a possible objective. And so defense has to be there to provide that level of protection and resilience to all the elements like it is in the normal society, in the normal domain that you know already. I mean, I don't see any big difference in conceptual terms. So welcome if we are progressing nicely. I mean, there will be always a nice defense suggestion to, for example, suggest that probably it's better that you invest that 5% more on your satellite to ensure this kind of protection. Because yes, it's going to add 5% of your cost, but it will prevent that somebody can deny service of your satellites in a very short term. And that is some element of cross-feeding that it will be always present. So I don't see competition, really.
All right, let's move to the audience questions. Please raise your hand.
Thank you. A question to Joost, listening to you, and you said you sold, I think you sold satellites, you operate own satellites, you give access to satellites to others. And listening to the story of this startup starting on H2020, in fact, isn't this a model approach that could be considered for part of an IRIS²? Is there anything fundamentally different in terms of dynamic you ingested in the system that couldn't be done? Now you are remote sensing, but communications is communications, right? So is there a fundamental difference why you are different, or could this be applied?
Fundamentally, I think the same principles would in theory apply as well. So in that sense, I would agree with your point that you could apply the same type of principles. The only difference is telecoms is usually even larger numbers, but the same principles would apply. Yeah, I agree.
All right. Do we have a, yeah, lady in the back?
Thank you very much to the audience. Alessandra De Angelis, GRC. We heard in the context of the discussion of the need to defend our space systems and assets, and at the same time, at the need to make them more resilient. We also heard about the key role of the space economy and the growing role of civilians infrastructure. So in the end of the day, when we have to protect this infrastructure, we face basically operators of these infrastructures and infrastructures that are owned, managed, and operated both by member states and private entities. So it's not always easy to understand who is critical in face of degradation. And I was wondering, is it something that we should maybe asking for the future also? Yeah, thank you.
If I can
Director?
quickly answer, yes, absolutely, you're right. We are talking a lot, especially recently in the past 2 years, due to the international situation, how important it is to protect our critical infrastructures. And when we are talking about critical infrastructures, I'm not talking about only military points or elements. I'm talking about society critical infrastructures that are really a lot. And probably is the right moment, and the situation give us the opportunity to stop and think about what is really the criticalities in the different elements, and to assess that and try to eventually provide guidance to the member state. In many areas, they are totally independent. But if I look, for example, at the bank system study criticalities in security or transactional securities. You know, a long time ago, they developed a set of rules to make sure that their interbank, communication followed specific protocols, even if they were private industry. Why that? Because the risk of being compromised is much higher, than the cost involved in adapting the structure. I think it's time that Europe sometimes look at that. We did for energy. We start to do a big reflection on energy, security of supply is another element that we were starting to look at in critical materials, another good element. I think we should look at something that we cannot touch, we cannot feel, but is very much relevant when we see that our GPS has gone, or when we see that the electrical power system doesn't work because the satellite synchronizing the system, is not working. And that is critical infrastructure. That is not only like it was 50 years ago, I don't know, an industry only, or a bank, or a pylon, or a bridge, or something. Now we have to address even non-material sometimes, or materials that are space services or space capabilities. So yes, I do think that it should be a strand that should be explored much more. Thank you.
I can. Yes, and at European level, of course, we have a lot of regulations and legislation to look at that. Critical entities, the NIS2 directive, which looks at cybersecurity. Member states on their own have certain regulations. And I think the part of the driver of this EU space law is exactly that. We need to enhance the collective level of security of our space infrastructures. How to do that? We have to make a certain minimum standards in terms of how we manage security risks, or how we deal with cybersecurity. And we need to look at space as a critical, one of the essential critical infrastructures, but also as an enabler and a factor in other critical infrastructures. So a disruption in our space system has repercussions and destructive effects on many other infrastructures. So I think with the space law, we would like to incentivize this is the big objective, to incentivize a single market for space. But behind that, we also need to ensure that we protect our space infrastructures.
Let's take one final question from the back.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I just had a question, and it's a bit of a crystal ball exercise. So maybe Joost, you want to take it first for industry poll. Commercialization isn't necessarily the EU model, and we see what the US has decided to do on that front, and they continue as a government to invest in commercial players. It's not necessarily how we want to be moving forward in Europe. And personally, I agree that that's not necessarily the best method. How can you hold industry accountable for geopolitical dimensions? So I'd really like to understand, and using Ukraine as a case study, moving beyond SATCOM, where have the member states identified a direct need for space and defense strategies to be built? An example as well is last week at the in-orbit servicing event organized by the Commission, MODs didn't actually have so much appetite for in-orbit servicing. And iOS companies were concerned that the defense angle, SDA, SSA, isn't as attractive for them to continue investing. So maybe Joost, you said you were a commercial player, then more defense. How, as you of a company, have you changed your services, and beyond EO, what's the next step? Maybe space data. And how are the institutions working with member states to create that need to signal to industry how they need to be adapting their services? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot to pack into one answer. So just to pick up, there's a lot to pick out there. I think indeed we've learned a lot from the Ukraine. A lot of it I can't disclose here, of course, on how we, I would say, tailor our offering to the different needs and the different users that we have there as well. And so that has evolved. I think one of the key things that we're doing at the company level is that we have different types of products that we offer as well. So it's not just a picture, but we offer leasing as well of capacity, which is much more a product that can be tailored to a specific customer and a specific need. So we can go all the way from ownership to a product, to taking a picture, to doing leasing, to also to sort of added value services. So we've differentiated much more and segmented into the specific needs that we saw from the customers that are emerging. That goes beyond defense, I have to say, though. But especially the leasing option is an interesting option that we developed actually based on the feedback that we had from the field, where if you need something immediate, we can give it to you now because it's already in orbit. And I'll leave the other questions to unpack after, because then maybe some other people can comment, and I see we're already running late. So I hope that answers part of the questions at least.
Final word from the panel.
Let me say that some MODs or some joint staff have a clear idea of what are the capability needed. Obviously, there is still a very much a national perspective on that. And they are elements that are not really disclosing nicely unless they have specific activities where it's convenient to disclose. So I'm looking here, to have a good tool and incentives to create a project in specific direction where a certain number of this priority will be unfilled. I already mentioned space security, space situational awareness as very important. You need to know where are you going. Then obviously human flight in the space is very relevant. Maneuver capabilities in space is another very relevant element. The orbiting satellites, make them maneuverable, even not to represent a fixed target. That's, for example, another capability that many are looking. In other fields, spoofing, it was already mentioned, electronic warfare, jamming is another big elements that has to be tailored. And even some new capability that they do not work very well here on Earth, but they work perfectly in space, like energy weapons or energy elements. And believe me, you could lose a satellite in space without knowing who is the responsible for it. So, I mean, there are elements really that are very clear. This is unclassified, and I have no problem in talking about that. But I mean, there are elements, believe me.
If I may, I don't think that a conference is the right place for the military to express their needs. We have different different ways of sourcing this demand. I think that building these synergies between space and defense is one of the big topics we have to work for the future. The space strategy mentions a few areas, a few actions, the Earth observation governmental service, one of them, space domain awareness, in-orbit servicing and operations as well. There are many applications that may have dual use potential. So what in the Commission we're trying to do is to use what we have at our, well, military operations is not within our competence, okay? But we can build dual use capacities, whether these are supported through the Defense Fund for R&D or in member states' defense capabilities in space, or developing civilian structures or infrastructures that can have a dual use potential afterwards. So breaking the silos and making these bridges is something where we need to explore much more in the future. It brings economies of scale, but it also addresses the needs of civilian and military users.
Thank you for all your contributions, as well as for the audience for really active involvement in the latter part of the panel. Due to the time that we no longer have, I need to close the session. So I'll ask everyone for one round of applause for our panelists, and then we'll give the floor to them.